I'm talking about translation theories and how the translation and adaptation theories tend not to unify with each other for reasons mostly due to departmental inertia. I start off with Lawrence Venuti, who wrote in 2007 that the theoretical views advanced by adaptation scholars such as Robert Stamm were being essentialist in his belief that ideology and social discourses in adaptation are readily identifiable, unmediated by cultural or other issues. The intellectual fallacy could be readily overcome if Stamm used direct translation theory with its specific emphasis on meanings, values, and functions. Translation studies possesses sufficient intellectual breadth to accommodate the adaptation studies agenda, but the quasi-colonialist relationship between translation and adaptation studies continues to obstruct any constructive attempts at disciplinary collaboration. There are several explanations for this stance, one of which forces us to go back into history. In the early 19th century, German Romantic theorists such as Friedrich Schleiermacher identified themselves as writers or translators possessed of sufficient imagination and ability to create a window for all readers of a source text's stylistic and thematic qualities. Schleiermacher's ideas were developed in Matthew Arnold's series of lectures on translating Homer, where he perceived good translators as visionaries able to render Homeric verse in clear, accessible language, revealing the source text's greatness. This approach to translation appealed to the intelligentsia, who were believed to absorb the lessons of the text and disseminate them to those unable to access the text for themselves. By contrast, adaptations were consigned to the lower echelons of Victorian cultural life, being largely regarded as utilitarian products commissioned by theatre companies and actor managers in search of quick profits. As the 20th century unfolded, so the translator's status improved. Due to the efforts of literary figures like T.S. Eliot, they were regarded as creative artists in their own right, who created their own versions of the source text that recreated its spirit rather than keeping to the letter. Issues of fidelity became outmoded to be superseded by the more flexible term of equivalence. Through the work of the Russian formalists and the Prague Linguistic Circle, among others, translation theory established a framework of norms to maintain high standards of translation, now recognized as a scientific as well as a humanities-based discipline. In 1952, James McFarlane wrote an article summing up the discipline's current position by drawing on formalist ideas of identity. Issues of identity, literalness, and equivalence were peripheral. What mattered more was to discover the symbolic reference of the source text style and use that knowledge to identify the referential meaning of the translation. The symbolic reference covered a text's literary, sociological, or anthropological significance and emerged through a complex process of unpacking the source text. Translators subsequently attempted to recreate that symbolic reference by concentrating on emotive meaning. This is no easy task due to the wide structural and semiotic differences between languages. McFarlane perceived translation as a collaborative activity where translators took advice from colleagues in different disciplines and reshaped their text as a result. Drawing on I.A. Richards' Principles of Literary Criticism, first published in 1924, he argues how literary translators should be specialists in their discipline to recreate the hortatory or persuasive meaning of the source text through structuralist and formalist methods. McFarlane's arguments indicates just how differently translation was approached compared to adaptation. It was not until 1957, when George Bluestone published Novels into Film, that adaptation studies made its first foray into formalism, and even then, the discipline's enduring preoccupation with fidelity and literacy made it seem rather old-fashioned, a throwback to a pre-modernist era when Arnoldian notions of textual purity dominated the intellectual agenda. Translators appeared to be more receptive to recent theoretical elements, regardless of their geographical origins, by drawing on authorities that combined literary criticism and linguistics. Translation studies began to develop into a self-contained discipline in higher education institutions. In 1977, James Holmes drew a distinction between pure and applied translation studies that determined curriculum organization. The one involves the scientific application of translation theory to the practice of translation. The other demands disciplinary progress through research and publication. In an academic environment, translation studies became largely self-sufficient, catering both to the professional and the academic sectors. Thus, it's hardly surprising that adaptation studies, torn between literature and film studies department, was largely considered a subordinate discipline. The intellectual positions separating the two had hardly shifted. Writing in 1979, the linguist Lewis Kelly summed up adaptation's principal objective by invoking familiar theoretical notions. If alterations are required in the target text, they should be carefully planned to, quote, restore the balance of forces of intellectual presence, which to the translators acute comprehension has disrupted, close quote. The act of reworking a source text identified in the same language or a foreign language is defined as disruptive and requires careful construction to render it as faithful as possible. Otherwise, quote, the balance of forces, unquote, that made this source text worth translating in the first text, the source text, will be lost. The use of this term, balance of forces, suggests a universalist approach to textual translation, one that would be more suitable for adaptation studies rather than the more context-specific discipline of translation studies. It comes as no surprise to find contemporary translation studies experts reaffirming their belief in the discipline's potential to absorb adaptation altogether or provide suitable theoretical models for adaptation's future progress. Patrick Catrice's descriptive adaptation studies believes that adaptation will be invested with scientific validity if it draws on direct translation studies, as well as tracing the historical antecedents of authorship. In contrast, Thomas Leach, in his review for adaptation, detects an implied triumphalism in Catrice's determination to establish a single, unimpeachable image, direct translation, for the ideas he considers essential to adaptation studies. Such convictions in the innate superiority of translation over adaptation studies are widely hailed. Lawrence Venuti's recent anthology of papers involving added translation offers advice and case studies in a structure highly reminiscent of de Cartmel and Whelan's Teaching Adaptations, 2014, and my co-written work with Tony Gurr, Adaptation and Learning, 2013. We hear a lot about cross-cultural reflection and the relationship between translation and foreign language learning, not to mention the significance of group work, with educators treated as facilitators rather than transmitters of knowledge and institution. In view of the topics covered, it seems a shame that Venuti should have opted for discipline specificity, but entirely consistent with the prevailing reluctance to engage in cross-disciplinary examination. One of the explanations for this position has a lot to do with disciplinary fence building, based on the assumption that translation studies has established research agendas resembling in those in adaptation studies, but doesn't want to learn anything from adaptation studies. Marta Minier offers an alternative view by claiming that no recognizable criteria exist to separate the two disciplines. They both depend on shifting cultural norms. Localization has become one of the most popular areas of translation studies, with emphasis placed on the readers as well as the creators of texts. What is missing at present is an approach to linking global with local issues and how they impact on the present and future theoretical direction of translation and adaptation studies. We are all familiar with the stereotypical representation of translation as concerned with the written word, while adaptation concentrates on film, television, new media and video games. But we need to understand whether individual consumers observe such distinctions, especially at a time when the digital age has revolutionized the theoretical agenda of translation and adaptation. On this view, translation and adaptation are created as complex yet intimately related processes of textual transformation. An emphasis on individual as collective communication between creative workers and critics, either face-to-face or online, helps to democratize the creative process, as well as improving self-esteem. In an age of transnationalism, historical squabbles seem rather insignificant. What matters is to increase communication designed to increase disciplinary cooperation.